I'm Nate Otto. I've been studying digital badge systems with the Design Principles Documentation Project for the last year. The project was going a whole year before I joined it, and I've sort of helped them come together with what we're actually publishing. We're just finishing up. We have a website we've got a bunch of stuff on, and I'm going to just talk about what our research methods were. I'm also the secretary of the Badge Alliance Research Working Group, studying badges, and we'd love to have lots more of you come in and talk to our research group about the presentations you've been making and all the good work you've been doing. So, special thanks to the Mozilla Foundation and to the MacArthur Foundation, especially the MacArthur Foundation. They funded us through their Digital Media and Learning Fund. And so what I'm presenting is a method for studying digital badge systems. And so this isn't exactly how to build a system, but you can draw lessons that might help you figure out how to build a badge system. And so this is the paper. You can all read it on your USB drives. And our project website, dpdproject.info, has a whole lot more resources. I'll post these slides as soon as I can figure out how to get SlideShare working. And so this is the project team that we worked under, led by Daniel T. Hickey at Indiana University. He's a professor of the learning sciences. And we have a bunch of grad students from Indiana University and UC Irvine as well. And so this was, in 2012, the MacArthur Foundation had a grant program where they funded 30 different projects to build a badge system for badges for lifelong learning. So they funded 30 different projects. And all of these and their technology partners put together some kind of system to issue badges and award people the badges for learning, mostly informal contexts like after-school clubs. You can see like the Providence After School Alliance, science fairs, some things that were done in school, in formal classes, and then also some like adult education programs as well. So a bunch of different contexts, really sort of badges for lifelong learning, talking about how badges could apply across many different phases of life. And then this grant also funded our project to study what was happening in all these project designs. And so we interviewed everybody who was involved in designing each of the badge systems, and our goal was to find out what they're doing. Very, very open-ended construct. And so what we did is we decided we wanted to study 4 different things about how they built their badge systems. 4 different functions of practices in those systems. And so when you put together a system, you decide on a set of what you're going to do to serve a bunch of different functions that will all come together to advance the goal of the organization. And so what you have to do is you have to figure out how to recognize learning, you say assess learning, and then all your decisions there will affect how students will be motivated to participate, whether they'll be excited about it or whether they won't see the badges as very valuable. And then we also wanted to see how people were looking at what was happening in their own system and designing practices to study what was going on. And so this is a dish in the United States called pulled pork. I don't know, you probably have something very similar in all your countries. Very slow cooked meat where you cook it for a really long time and then you can just like grab forks and just pull it apart and you can see all the different strands. And so I sort of think that that's what we did with these projects, is we interviewed them and pulled apart their practices where they were designing a set of practices that they thought were just one thing, the whole system, and we wanted to see how they did different functions within that system. So we sort of pulled it apart and we could see the connections between the different practices, and then that helped us compare what was happening in different projects. So what we call a badge system, and you use this word, this is the collection of different practices. So I decide, one type of assessment, one test I'm going to give to my students, that's one practice. And then I have another practice, like I'm going to have an e-portfolio for people to upload evidence, and we'll use that to share and build discussion among our peers. That would be a different practice. And altogether, all the different practices come to advance one goal of using badges to recognize some type of learning. And we in addition to sort of having this structure where we're going to look at these 4 categories, we also looked at how these practices evolved over 3 different phases. One was the original design, what the badge designers thought they were going to do before they had even ever tried anything with badges. And then we saw what they were able to first actually implement when they got together with their technology partner, their platform Moodle or WordPress, WP Badger or whatever, what they were actually able to get done first. And it wasn't everything that they wanted to do. And then another year later, we interviewed them again to see what they were still doing and whether they had decided that their initial practices were a good idea or not, and stopped some and kept going with others. And so we had an idea of what practices were hard to implement, what ones were easy. We're trying to come up with where people were having common challenges. So we say projects that were building badge systems. What they were really doing is designing, enacting, and formalizing practices to build badge systems. Again, in these 4 categories, and I'll say a little bit about what actually those 4 mean to us. Recognizing learning is the decisions they had to make about what the badges actually would mean when someone earned one, what claim that would make about what the earner could do, the skill they had, or the competency, or what they had done, the achievement, as well as how badges were structured in the system, whether you had to earn one before another, rules like that, and then what sort of the intended audience those badges were, how people would unlock their value, or whether they would put them on a CV or a resume, or if they would only talk about them among their peers already. For each of the claims you wanted to make about a badge, you have to have an assessment that will measure whether or not that person has really earned the badge, for 2 reasons. One, to just decide, okay, can I issue the badge now, or should I not? And then the second reason is to collect the right kind of evidence to put in the badge to support that claim, so that if someone later on doesn't trust me as an assessor, they can look at what evidence was there and say, okay, the student really did have this skill. All of the decisions you make in those first 2 categories affect how students will be motivated. And it's not simply a question of, are students interested in badges? Do they want to earn them? It's much richer, and students will be motivated to participate in certain activities and not others, and we're trying to get some idea of whether we can make good comparisons across the group. And then we had projects, as I was saying, studying learning for several different purposes, whether to understand what was going on in their system, just sort of basic level, or whether they wanted to feed that information back into the system design to improve the system. And then the main part of our work was to take all those practices that we identified from looking at design documents and interviewing people and see whether there were similar things between them, whether we could come up with general design principles, what we call it. And so we started with writing all of each practice, giving it a name and putting it on a card, and then trying to see which of them were similar. And then when we had groups of similar practices, we came up with names that would describe that group as a general principle outside of the context. We worked on workshops and got a lot of feedback on those, and came up with a list of general principles that we think represent what was happening in these 30 badge systems. And this little picture I came up with to describe the difference between a specific practice in a project, this is what the person designed, and then a general principle is if you take the context out of that practice and make it so that, like if my practice is that I have a quest pathway where you have to earn this badge on, I'm going to use an example from one of our projects on, climate science. You have to earn the ocean tide pool badge before you can get to the deep water badge. That's the practice in that context, but the general principle would just be a pathway that describes an order that you have to earn badges in. And we can see how different projects applied that in their own contexts. So this is one example. The hierarchical quest paths that I mentioned, that was National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Planet Stewards. That was the name of the practice that we gave for them. And that was an example of this principle. Use badges to map learning trajectory. This is the general principle that could apply to many different practices. 18 of the different of the 30 projects we studied used this principle in some way. And they used it, all in their own context. Two different sort of main categories, broke some of these down. Some were levels and some were pathways. And so overall, just an example, these are the different principles we came up with for recognizing learning and how many different projects used them. So 18 projects used badges to map learning trajectory, 11 of them used levels, and 7 pathways. And then so this shows those 3 different phases that we tracked how a principle developed, from intended, what their initial design was, to what they first were able to implement, to what their formal and continuing practice was. And so in these 2 different projects, we have this giant table of 30 projects and 82 specific principles. Shows that both of these 2 projects, they had intended to use this principle of using badges to map learning trajectory. PASA wanted to do it, and then they weren't able to actually implement it. It was too hard. It didn't fit with what they wanted to do as they moved forward. But Climate Stewards made that absolutely core component of their system, and that was one of the ones that turned out to be the strongest for them. And so, I'll wrap up here. What can we learn by coming up with these general principles and being able to compare across these different projects to say, what can we tell by saying that PASA didn't do it, but Climate Stewards did? And I think there are 3 sort of main categories of what we can learn, and we have on our website a bunch of case studies and analyses that talk about the different things we learned. And one, we can just tell who were similar, how does a project studying climate science in high school for 16 to 18-year-olds, how is that the same from an after-school club or a workforce development program? And then we can figure out which components of building with badges are hard to do and which ones are easy to do, and figure out whether there are lessons that we need to sort of teach the wider community about why that might be hard. And then I think very important is talk about what principles are appropriate for certain contexts. What factors are there in a project's situation that makes it easy or hard to enact a certain type of practice? And so hopefully, as we study all this data, we'll be able to come up with interesting findings in each of these 3 categories. So I talked really fast. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free. And that's our website. That'll be up.
Thanks, Nate.
Thank you.
Okay, quick questions or the next speaker, or comments?
How many pieces were formal? How many most informal?
Most were informal. So the question was just how many of the 30 projects were formal learning and how many were informal. I would say probably only 5 of the projects were formal, like within a classroom. Maybe between 5 and 10. A couple of them were a curriculum that could be implemented in a classroom or an after-school club, and so there's a little bit sort of in between there. But most were just after-school clubs, let's say. Organizations that can move very quickly to implement a new type of practice, that they don't have to go through a bunch of layers of bureaucracy. Those were the organizations that were able to get grant funding and just move very quickly. And this project started in 2012 when Open Badges was barely getting to its 1.0 levels per year.
Quick second question, did you notice any important differences between the design principles between these formal and informal cases?
I don't know of anything right off the top of my head. I'm sure there is a bunch of conclusions we can make. We are just getting finished with the final round of interviews of all the projects, and then we'll start looking at our data really hardcore, and I'm sure we'll find some interesting things like that.
Thanks.
But yeah, definitely different things about what it tries to do.
What are those snacks? Badges or?
Yeah, so I have, what is this, eight decks of cards. Each of these deck of cards is, like I had that one card on there on the slideshow. We have one card for every principle that we identified, and so you can use this as a system design tool. So when you think about what you want to do when you're building a badge system, you can say, yes, I want to use badges to map learning trajectory, and lay them out on the table and sort of decide what fits well with what you want to do and what fits not well. And you also can take a look at this later.
Cool.